So today I'm going to be talking about just Akira Kurosawa himself and the receival of him in both Japan and the West. We talked a little bit in the past about how, a lot of presentations have been about the countries themselves. Like, let's say, for example, where you're from, and I wanted to do that, but I also wanted to prove, or I wanted to show that Kurosawa is a big part of the research that I do. So I want to just kind of get right into it. I'm a big fan of Rashomon. Did you guys raise your hands? Do you guys like Rashomon? Like the movie or the book? Yeah. I don't know. I don't really have ever a concrete answer for who did it. I mean, it's kind of a really quintessential movie because if you study film, or even if you study even if you like whodunit books, like a mystery novel, you'll know about the Rashomon effect, which is basically you have all these different stories from people who are not reliable narrators. Like, they're not this omniscient presence that they don't have a definite answer. You don't have a definite answer. And for all we know, we don't know the personalities. We don't know we barely know their names. In the stories, like the book and the movie, they're not given names. They're given their titles. So that's what's really always been powerful to me about Rashomon. It's always like everyone can have a different answer. And I think it's kind of telling about people what kind of person you are based on who you would choose. So Kurosawa himself, though, it's funny because I want to talk a little bit about his receival in Japan. So by a lot of Japanese, he was regarded in a very mixed opinion. Some of them liked him a lot because he was more so for a new era, a new generation, kind of like a very big shift in Japan. Where, for example, in I believe it's 1943, a new censor from the U.S. was appointed to Japan, and this censor was basically someone that the U.S. had chosen to choose what can be said in films. So these films, for example, it's a big problem that one of the censors had with Kurosawa, and what Kurosawa really believed kind of hindered him for a little bit, was the fact that some of his films were too feudalistic in their views and whatever kind of themes that they would bring up. And then in the West, I don't know if you guys know Jean-Luc Godard. He's a very big French director. He's a pioneer of this whole movement called French New Wave, which lasted, I believe, from sometime in the 1920s to 1940s. And he criticized Kurosawa because he compared him a lot to this other director, Mizoguchi. Mizoguchi is more so you can kind of define Mizoguchi and Kurosawa a little bit hand in hand. It's a little lazy to do so, but Mizoguchi is the pre-war Kurosawa. Kurosawa is the post-war Mizoguchi. So Godard, he just says that he's a little bit more refined. He states Kurosawa as a slightly more refined Mizoguchi. And what Kurosawa really lacks is, he states that Kurosawa lacks what every Japanese filmmaker should strive for in the time, which is individuality. Which Godard believes that Mizoguchi really achieved this universal kind of outlook on the world, and that it's a little bit of an iffy idea because he states that Mizoguchi is Japan. So Mizoguchi is Japan to Godard. And then a lot of critiques come from this for Kurosawa, where he's a lot of critics say that Kurosawa, his films aren't Japanese enough, or they lack Japaneseness, which it's a little hard to describe, but if you think about it from a U.S. perspective, a U.S. film at the time, post-war, usually was going to be either a fantasy film, like for example Disney's Fantasia, which was the only film during the time of the newly appointed censor, during the war, when foreign films were completely banned in Japan, you could only show Japanese films, or some films that are very big exceptions to the rule from before the ban. But the one person that was allowed to do this by the government was a director who, his name escapes me now, but he made a movie about the story of Momotaro and the Sea. And this was the exception because, for example, Disney's Fantasia. I don't know if we know Fantasia, but Fantasia was the only movie during the war from outside Japan that was allowed in Japan. because a lot of the government, they said, well, they recognize that films are powerful because everyone, for the most part, if they could, they can see a film. Um, what really stuck out to them is that they carry such profound messages and they're very easy to push onto people. So, for example, these Japanese directors during the war, they'd say, the government would say, okay, you need to push a nationalist idea, you need to push this for our military, you need to do this. Which is similar, which the West, it's interesting because you look at America during this time, there's a nationalist idea after the war in a rebuilding period. So, what I've always found interesting is just the idea that it's a censorship, the censorship entire like debacle surrounding both the West and Japan in their own respective ways. Because for the West, America specifically, in 1915, there was a whole Supreme Court mandate that films are only used for business. Even though films are under a First Amendment right, which is for Americans, it's basically right of freedom of speech. So, the Supreme Court rules that in this time that films aren't made for art. There's no art behind it. They can't do anything about that. They're only used for business and governments. Which then follows the U.S.'s studio system, which is basically the studios give these auteurs or directors, they give them no freedom in terms of like any kind of what they say or what they do. The studios themselves are the ones that make the films. So you go back then, you look at maybe like a Warner Bros. Film, you'll say, oh, well, it's made by this guy, but this guy was for Warner Bros., so it's a Warner Bros. Movie. And it only was, I believe, in 1957 that the Supreme Court then went back to it. Then they ruled that film was art, and that's protected under First Amendment rights. And then they went back on that a little while after and said, okay, well, we have to protect the next generation and these children from seeing whatever a film can show. So then they went back on their word and they said that film's only used for business, and there's no studio system at this point in time, but directors can only do so much within a film. But now the only difference is the rating. There's a rating system. So you have G, you have PG, PG-13, R, X, whatever, and this is basically saying you can see these films if you're under this age or if you're above this age, and it's not made for you. It's made for these age groups. So censorship plays a massive part in the entirety of Kurosawa's filmography. For example, Scandal. Scandal came out when the censorship was over, so he could kind of say what he wanted. And then he had, I believe it was three films that came out during the censorship. And it was only after the censor was lifted that he really felt like he made his like magnum opus. So with Rashomon, it's funny that people critique him for not having enough Japanese in this, but this is back in the time of a feudal era where I would say it's Japanese enough for the time. That's what the censor really didn't want to promote to Japan at the time, was a feudal idea with the entire change in government, with the U.S. kind of pushing them, well, not kind of, the U.S. full force pushing themselves into the government to try and reshape it. Another critique of Kurosawa was that he was a collectivist. So, but what's really interesting about Kurosawa is that even though he's deemed as a collectivist, it was never his idea to be a collectivist. He was more so seen in a kind of gray area. The West might see him as someone who wanted to push things forward. A fair amount of Japan does too. An older generation of Japan would see him in the same way, as someone who wants to push Japan forward after the war. But then some that critique him, like I said, they see him as feudalistic in views. And a lot of people as well critiqued his films as the sentimentality of his films as something naive, that it's kind of this pipe dream that he has where everything works out in the end, where there's a film that involves two lovers, they're incredibly poor, and there's a few things in the film, like for example, when they start laughing over the high prices in a diner, and they really bond over that, but then there's a rude awakening that the two have in one of their apartments, where it's leaky, it's small, it's not really, it's impossible to be kept because it's just there's no proper standard. So critics received this kind of sentimentality of bonding over things that the only things that it really could as something naive, and they wanted to really push this. They wanted to kind of keep him in this weird middle ground where he wasn't. They didn't want to make him see. They wanted him to be Japanese, but then they didn't want him to be Western. But then they also wanted to be. They wanted him to still be a little Western in promoting these new ideas that were pushed in Japan. But then he had to keep his Japanese-ness to audiences. So all in all, I do think that Kurosawa really, if you look at both Kurosawa and Mizoguchi, they're very similar in their crafts, but in every other way, they're completely different in how they really bring across a message. One of them is more Western. One of them is perceived as new. The other one is perceived as old, and to some people, the old is better. But it's really to each their own. I have more of a preference for Kurosawa. I think he's a fantastic filmmaker, and you can't get anywhere if you don't go forward. So I think Kurosawa is fantastic, and that is all. So yeah, that's it.